Awesome. All right. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to the fifth and final workshop of the NHERI GSC Research Tools Workshop Series, which is a NHERI GSC effort in collaboration with our colleagues at the NHERI SimCenter. And so the topic of today's workshop is data integration using relational databases and application programming interfaces. And so similar to the previous workshops in this series, today's talk will be recorded for future reference and then also to share with those who weren't able to join today. So you will be able to access that from the NHERI GSC page. And so this workshop series has been a collaborative effort among students in the NHERI Graduate Student Council. And so really our purpose in the NHERI GSC is to build a diverse graduate community for natural hazards researchers, to connect with diverse mentors in the natural hazards community, to attend natural hazards research and career workshops, to encourage diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations, and to learn about the impact of research on natural hazards practice, and then last, to gain leadership service and funding opportunities. And so for those present here who are graduate students or researchers and are not currently members of the GSC, you can scan the QR code that's on this slide to join us and then become involved in these types of events with fellow like-minded researchers. And then for any non-graduate students here, we would still love for you to become involved if you're interested in supporting the NHERI GSC. And so now I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Scott Brandenburg. Dr. Brandenburg is a professor in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at the University of California, Los Angeles. And his research expertise lies primarily in geotechnical earthquake engineering, with focus on soil structure interaction, multi-hazard reliability of levee systems, seismic earth pressures acting on earth retention systems, and cyber infrastructure projects, as well as many other things. He earned his PhD and master's from the University of California, Davis, and has authored over 100 technical papers. He served as the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion from 2017 through 2020, and is a co-PI of NHERI Design Safe, which I'm sure many of you in the audience are very familiar with. I personally use it all the time, mainly for uploading and downloading my post-disaster reconnaissance data that I collect. And so thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Brandenburg. I'll now turn things over to you. And if anyone has any questions, please hold them until the end, and then we'll have time at the end to address questions that everybody has.
Great, thanks, Jasmine.
Is everyone else hearing that as well, or is it just me?
To quickly introduce the NHERI Graduate Student Council.
It's just me, okay.
No, I hear there's some kind of echo.
Yeah, I also hear it.
I only heard it when you were unmuted though, Robin.
Yeah, so it was coming from me, so it was on my side. I'm sorry, I apologize.
No problem. So I'll go ahead and get the screen share started. Let's see. Hopefully you can all see that okay. It's in the right mode and everything, not like where you see my notes. Okay. So thanks very much for the introduction. As Jasmine mentioned, I'll talk today about relational databases and APIs, which are things that I think a lot of natural hazards researchers aren't all that familiar with. And so it'll be a pretty introductory level talk about these things. If you already know about SQL and using APIs and have written APIs, this will be very much basic kind of presentation. But if you've never heard about these things, it may open your eyes to what's really the foundation of data science, which is, building the data sets. That's actually what data scientists do with most of their time is work with data. So it's a way of structuring data to facilitate things like machine learning and AI, which I know is something that a lot of students and faculty and everybody is really interested in these days. So why is the structure of the data important? So what I'm fundamentally talking about today is how to organize and structure data, so it's clear to other people how they can use it and they can query it to get out the information that they want. So I'm just going to post some screenshots of articles that I found online about this. So why data preparation is an important part of data science, So there's a little meme of like an angry person, clean all the data, right? So before you throw your data into a neural network or some kind of deep learning algorithm or something like that, you want to make sure that the data is good and that it's all organized and there's not spurious data points in there. And so that's a huge chunk of the time that people spend. So here's one that says, cleaning big data is the most time-consuming and least enjoyable data science task, right? So 76% of data scientists said that the least enjoyable part is working with the data. So thanks for being here for this talk today, which is all about working with the data, which is kind of like the drudgery of data science, right? The important part. This one is showing kind of a survey of data scientists that divides their time into different categories. And if you look, data loading is 19%. I guess, I don't know what data loading means. Is that just like opening files maybe? Then there's data cleansing, which is like the part that everybody hates so much. Data visualization, which, can be kind of cool, but that's well over 50% of the time. Then they have model selection, model training and scoring is what a lot of us want to do, right? That's so many people are like, if you give me a bunch of data, I have an algorithm that can, you ingest this data and spit out a model that will be 94% accurate or something like that. But, look at how big of a chunk the data part is. So as natural science, natural hazards researchers, we should really focus our attention on the data part. This is where the domain expertise lies. Maybe some of us are advancing AI models and things like that, but that's largely in the computer science domain. And then breaking the 80-20 rule. So the 80-20 rules that data scientists are spending 80% of their time doing things they don't want to do, like clean data, work with data, and then only 20% actually doing the fun stuff, which would be training models, looking at the confusion matrix. Everybody wants to have like a perfect confusion matrix, declare victory, and write a paper on their AI model, right? That it's so great. It's like a perfect predictor, much better than what you could have gotten otherwise. And then here's another one. This one calls data like janitor work. So it likens it to mopping the floor and, cleaning things up. And I've done some pretty terrible, like manual labor related jobs in my day. So I think that janitor work is a noble job, but, I understand what they're saying here. There's a lot of sort of manual labor kind of work that goes into preparing data. So why is data structure important? Data scientists spend most of their time preparing data. So if we're going to embark on any kind of modeling effort using AI or ML, we're going to spend a lot of time on this. Most data scientists would prefer to spend their time on the 20%, not on the 80%, right? That's like the more intellectually engaging part. And many students would like to become data scientists, or at least use data science to advance their research. I know when we do the Design Safe or the NHERI hackathon, the data science projects that use machine learning techniques are by far the most popular. That's what the students overwhelmingly want to do, which I think is great. I think we can learn a lot from it. I'm not anti-data science in any way. This is just focus on the building blocks. So I would argue that understanding structured data sets is really crucial for us to learn from what are pretty complicated data sets a lot of the time, like ones we encounter in natural hazards engineering. A lot of the time the data set is too large for us to simply open the entire text file or Excel file. We like to use tools that we're comfortable with. You can't have a 20 gigabyte Excel file and open it in Python or something like that. That's just going to exceed the RAM of your computer. And if we're really going to make use of large data, we have to do a better job than what we typically do with understanding data structure. So given that kind of motivation, what I'll do today is give kind of a brief overview of relational databases, and I'll explain what I mean by relational database. And then I'll talk about some of the databases that I'm working with now. So one of them is the next generation liquefaction database. If you're a geotechnical engineer, this would be really interesting to you. If you're not, it's still going to be interesting because it's really about the database, not about the science. I'm not going to focus on what we're learning about soil liquefaction, just how we're organizing the data for the community. And then the reason I'm presenting that one is that we have some tools in Design Safe intended for users to develop end-to-end workflows in Jupyter querying our data, working with it, and we're doing modeling development efforts that are doing this exact workflow. So it's a little different approach than what we've done before in my research team. And then I'll talk about APIs and data integration toward the end, which would be like bringing together data from different servers to learn from kind of intersection of different data types. So I'll start with this database 101 topic. So what is a data? Oh, I don't know why the text looks like that. Sorry, the font got messed up when I transferred the file to my other computer here. But what is a database? So I think we're all familiar with the idea of a database. And so a common definition that natural hazards researchers might use is just a collection of files, like a file repository. So engineer one might say, hey, could you send me your database about seismic protection of artifacts? And engineer two might say, sure. It's pretty big. It's like 5 gigabytes. So I'll just zip it for you and put it in a box folder and share that link with you, right? So that's one way that I've heard people talk about databases. Or better yet, engineer two could say, I already published it on Design Safe. You can just go to this link to get those files and they don't have to box up a 5 gigabyte file. All right, I'm getting annotations. I like it. Feel free to mark up if you have questions. You can underline stuff. I like the annotation feature of Zoom. And so here's an example of a file repository, right? This is seismic protection of artifacts with adhesives and base isolation. I'm not in any way affiliated with this project. I don't know Claire or anything, but this is a bunch of CSV files and it has data in it from some sort of experiment that was performed, which is great. And it's all published here, so users can come get it. And so there's, an example of what is commonly referred to as a database. There are some potential problems with this method of file repository. And I'm guessing many of you have probably encountered some of these problems in your own research if you've tried using other people's data products. So first, each research team might format their files differently. In fact, they're almost certainly going to format them differently, right? People who organize data into CSV or Excel files or something like that, they're going to decide to use different headers, put the data in a different structure. Sometimes it's not even consistent within the same research group. Like there'll be extra lines in some files. And so developing parsers to ingest the data becomes really difficult. I think a lot of people focus on making their data products human readable and don't worry so much about being computer readable. And so that causes all sorts of problems because when you open it, where the data is, but it's hard to write a parser that can find it. Actually, people are using AI to do that now too. So like GPT can automatically extract metadata and data from files that are kind of having all sorts of different formats. But anyway, the other thing too is that let's say you share 5 gigabytes of data with somebody and then the data changes. Well, they have to know what version of the data that they have. And usually we don't keep track of that on our own, right? Like if I go and update some data, I would have to rezip it and send it to them. And then if they ask me, hey, what version of the data did I have? I guess you could look at like the date that the file was created, but might not even have that file anymore. So, version control is a big deal. If you do publish in Design Safe, it handles version control. So you can publish and then create multiple versions and it's all stored. So that's a way of keeping track of it. And then the other thing is that relationships between files may not be clear or it may not be documented well. I've tried writing documentation and it's hard. People will reach out to me by email and ask, hey, what is this file? And then I have to go back and I don't even remember. I can't make sense of my own documentation from like years ago. So according to data scientists, this sort of file repository is not a database. So when we're talking about databases, if we're talking to computer scientists, they're going to think of something different and not just a repository of files, like the Design Safe Data Depot, for example. So they'll think of relational databases. And a relational database is a structured body of related information, and the data are organized into a set of tables that are formally described by an organizational structure or schema. So ahead of time, you have to provide like a skeleton for your data to go, a container for your data to go into, and then the fields in those tables can be related to each other through keys. So a primary key is a unique identifier. every row in a table has to have something unique about it. You don't want to duplicate an entire row. So the primary key is often an integer that gets automatically assigned anytime anybody enters data into a database. And it doesn't have to be automatically assigned or auto incremented. It could be something that you assign. I would stick with integers for primary keys because you're going to be joining tables on them and you can index them, and it's much faster than if you make like a really long string as a primary key or something like that. Okay, and then a foreign key is a field in one table that identifies a record from another table. And so this will become clear through an example, but the primary key foreign key pair is the way that we relate to different fields within different tables of a database. And then databases are typically accessed using structured query language or SQL. And there, sorry about the formatting. This isn't even like a Mac to PC issue. It's a PC to different PC issue. So I don't know what happened here. But there are different relational database management systems. MySQL is a common one. There's PostgreSQL. SQLite is one that I'll use today to just quickly demonstrate an example. And then there's MariaDB, Microsoft Access, Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle Database. There's even new products like MongoDB that are NoSQL or no organizational structure. They're basically JSON. So here's an example. Let me just walk you through kind of the way that natural hazards engineers might organize data and the way that it should be organized instead if we're going to do it in a relational database kind of way. So this is an earthquake ground motion example. And some of you who do earthquake research may be familiar with like the NGA flat file products. You can go download this big table and it has information about every ground motion. Often, I think there's like 27,000 rows and a lot of columns. So the file sizes are about 50 megabytes for NGA West 2. NGA sub became too big. You can't even download a flat file with all the ground motion data. You need to download different tables. So it's organized in a relational database form. But in this table, we have just a really basic set of information just for illustration purposes. We have an event name, so 2 different earthquakes, Westwood Hills and Hollywood Valley. I'm at UCLA, so these are all like LA references, right? They're not real earthquakes, by the way. Then 2 different magnitudes. Then we have the epicentral latitude and longitude there. Then we have different stations. So there's the Factor building. That's a real building on the UCLA campus that is instrumented in the Santa Monica courthouse. That's where I have to report to jury duty when I get called up. And then each station recorded each earthquake. So there's 4 rows here. And we have VS30, that's like a site parameter that defines the soil stiffness. RJB is the joiner bore distance from the station to the rupture, and then PGA is the peak acceleration. Of course, you'd have spectral acceleration and other things too. So there's a couple of problems with this database, with this flat file, if we're going to organize data this way. One thing is that we have duplicates here, right? Westwood Hills has the event name, magnitude, latitude, longitude repeated, and as does Hollywood Valley. It's only repeated once, but it is repeated. A common thing that happens is that an initial magnitude will come out soon after an earthquake that's based on a limited set of data, and then earth scientists will refine those magnitude estimates by studying ground motion. So what if we update magnitude from 6.3 to 6.4? We would now have to go through this and update it in 2 different locations. And this is only 2. Usually we would get like thousands of ground motion records from a single earthquake. So now we would have to go through and update it thousands of times. You can see that it's almost impossible not to make mistakes that way, right? So there's a data integrity problem here. Same thing for the Factor building in Santa Monica courthouse. Those are duplicated here. So we want to avoid duplication. That's the 3rd normal form of database management. So really, we want to divide this into different tables. We have a table that has events. We have a table that has station. There should be an N there. It got cut off, statio. Then we have a table that has ground motions. So apples, oranges, and bananas, right? These are really 3 different things. So if we separated them into different tables and organized them in a relational database, this is what it would look like, right? We have an event table. The event ID is the primary key. Then we have a station table, and then there's a primary key there as well. And then the motion table would link these 2 things together. So you have the motion ID primary key, and then an event ID would refer to the Westwood Hills event here for 1 and the Hollywood Valley event for 2, and then the station ID would refer to Factor Building for 1 and Santa Monica Courthouse for 2. And then we need to know how far that station was from the rupture and what the PGA was. So these are unique pieces of information that go with these things. In this way, if somebody updates the magnitude, we change it in one place, and then it's mapped out to all of the ground motion data already. So, okay, so then let's talk about querying relational databases. Now that we have data in different tables, let's say we wanted to produce that flat file because it is a useful thing for us to look at. How would we do that? Well, that's where the query would come in. So we would have a query like this one, select every, so star just means select everything. And well, maybe first I should say that there's different types of joins you can do. The default join is an inner join. So if you just put join, or you could either do inner join or just join, that's the default type. It will take everything where the table is intersecting. So there's other kind of joins too, like if you want all of table 1 and then just the part of table 2 that intersects with it, you could do a left join between table 1 and table 2. If you wanted all of table 2 and then just the table 1 information that intersects, you could do a right join. And then some database management systems allow a full outer join where you would have all of the information from table 1 and table 2, and there would be an intersection where certain fields would be populated and then they would be blank in a lot of other places. So anyway, this is how the query would look. Select everything from the motion table. We're going to join that with the site table on motion.stationID. This should be station, not site. Sorry about that. Motion.stationID equals station.stationID. So that's how we link together the primary and foreign keys in the database. And then we would also interjoin with event on motion.eventID equals event.eventID. And that would give us this table right here. So you see you've got event ID, event name, and all that stuff. Then you'll get a duplicate event ID and a duplicate station ID. And that's because we've done select star, right? So the event ID is in the event table, and it's also in the motion table as a foreign key. So it gets duplicated, which is something we usually don't want to have happen, right? We don't want to have a table with 2 duplicated columns. So in general, this select star notation is not very good. We want to specify the fields that we want to query from the database. It'll make our query faster too. So here I've put in all the fields, and that will get rid of the duplicated event ID fields here. And then let's say we only wanted information for the Westwood Hills earthquake. We could put where event ID equals 1, and then we only get this data right here. So it is common that we work with very large data sets, but at any given time for a particular application, we only want a small amount of that data. So you could open a file, which in this case, like the NGA West 2 flat file is about 50 megabytes, and then filter it and only take out the data you want to work with. That's kind of inefficient. It takes a long time to open a file that's that big. If you put it in a database, you don't need to open the whole file. It's already kind of like, you can think of it as already being open and ready for you to pull data from, and then you just get out the data that you want. It's already basically served up for you on a server. So then I'll just mention quickly, there's also NoSQL. So SQL does require a fairly rigid schema. You need to specify all of the columns and what the data types are and all of that stuff. Sometimes it's hard to organize data that perfectly fit into the schema, and you want it to be flexible and maybe evolve over time, and you can add new fields and you don't have to update the entire database schema as a result. So NoSQL does that for you. MongoDB, CouchDB, Cassandra, Amazon SimpleDB, and so forth. And oftentimes data are stored in a JSON format that is flexible, but you still have to define everything in your JSON string, and it can be more difficult to parse, right? So if you go this way, it's more flexible, but it's harder for users to use. So if we wanted to, we could organize all of this table data into this long JSON string that is mildly human readable. This isn't as human readable as a table or a flat file, but you could figure it out if you want. It's just a lot of parentheses and brackets, and I have a hard time following all of those sometimes. So okay, so let me go to a Jupyter notebook, and I have shared these too with Jasmine, so she can share these with whoever wants to see them. They're not very well documented, but hopefully combined with my presentation, they'll kind of make some sense. So I'm going to show you SQLite, which is a relational database management system that stores data in a local file. So it's not served up on a server for everybody else to use. This is not not the best way to necessarily make data available to everybody. But it is well suited to simple databases that just you or your research team want to use, and you don't want to make it available to everybody. And you don't need multiple people accessing at the same time to upload their memes or their cat videos, right? Like TikTok or Facebook or social media. You need to have a database that's run on a server for that so that people can upload to it from all over the world. This is a little more controlled. So let me just switch to this and I will run. Okay, so here's an example. Try and make this a little bigger. So this is just a Jupyter notebook that I'm running on DesignSafe's Jupyter Hub, but you don't need to be in DesignSafe for this to run. You could run it on your own computer or Google Colab or something like that. So up here, I'm just doing the import statements, import SQLite 3. That's a default package, so you don't have to pip install it or anything. It's just automatically going to be there with Python. And then I'm also importing error, which if there's an error in one of the database commands, you can print that error to the screen if you import this part of the package. And then to create a database, it's really easy. You just do connect database, gmdatabase.db, right? So I'll create that example flat file as a database here. And then you have to create a cursor object, which is what you use to access the database. So if I run this field, let's see, this should have created, yeah, there's my database file, right? It created seconds ago. It's, oh, it doesn't have the file size. It should be very small. There's nothing in it right now. Then in this next cell, what I'm doing is writing some commands to create tables. So this is where I'm defining the schema, kind of organizing the structure of the database. So I'm creating the event table here, and it has an event ID, event name, magnitude, latitude, longitude. Same thing here for station and for motion. So this is just creating those tables that I showed earlier. And so if I run this, unknown column, event ID. Okay, this is why live demos never work. This just ran like yesterday for me. So where am I going wrong? Oh, I know. Oops. Sorry about this. Man, my fonts are all messed up. Now I'm having trouble running this. I didn't create the fields for these. And so I need to create station ID in this table also and define the type. And actually what I'm going to do is just start over. I'm going to delete the database. Run this one, and then run this one. Ah, thank goodness it ran. So you can see the error did print for me, which helped me, right? So debugging on the fly is good. Then we can insert into the database. Oh yeah, something happened with the version of my file. I had this all set up to create the whole database before. I tell you what, I'll update the Jupyter notebook and send it to Jasmine again, because I think the one I sent you is maybe an older version. But if I run this, it's now inserted data into the event table. And there's, the data that I inserted is shown here through these values. You can also insert data directly from a pandas data frame if you wanted to do that. And then if we run this query, select everything from the event table, it should show us that we've got those data in there, right? So if you wanted to create a SQLite database, it's really easy. And this simple example is using a really small database. You can imagine this would be much more useful if you had a really large database, right? So in some of our research, we're creating SQLite databases that are terabytes in size. Some people will tell you your SQLite is really only for very small databases. We're making it work. You can have terabytes. Like one of them is going to be 9 terabytes when we're done to store results from simulation project. I think simulations are a really good application of SQLite databases because you can put the results in them. Usually you don't want all those results all at once, right? You want some small subset of the results, so you can just query it without having to open like thousands of different text files or one huge text file or something like that. So now I will go back to my presentation, and I'll do a real quick overview of the NGL database. So here's some pictures of soil liquefaction. If you're not familiar with it, you know, earthquake shaking causes sandy soil to temporarily behave like a liquid because the sand particles lose contact with each other and they're kind of like suspended in water for a short time until that sand and water either ruptures up to the surface or the soil settles. Both of those things can cause damage, like shown here from the Christchurch earthquake with this car that sunk into the ground. Can also cause lateral spreading, so there's lateral ground displacements toward a river. The way that liquefaction is predicted is semi-empirical. So this picture right here shows cases where a site was observed to have liquefied in solid red circles or to have not liquefied in open circles. And then there's some marginal ones where it's like, it was kind of on the verge of liquefaction. So that's probably very close to the dividing line. So this is really a problem of classified data, and we want to find a separator, right? There's different ways of doing that. Logistic regression, support vector machines, there's all kinds of ways of doing it. We don't have a huge amount of data, so it's actually really pretty easy to do it almost by hand. So Idris and Boulanger, or Boulanger and Idris here, have provided a separator with different probabilities of manifestation occurring. So we really need the data, right, as part of that. The data sets are pretty small, and a few data sets are really consequential. So the data that's close to the dividing line are really important, whereas data points that are far away and are obvious, those don't add much value for us. So even though there's a lot of data points on this plot, the position of that line is not controlled by a very large data set. We would benefit from having more data. So different people have used basically the same data set, or maybe some version of it, to provide different outcomes. There's been some arguing about liquefaction triggering and things like that in our field. And those are maybe because of inconsistent data sets, maybe different methods for data analysis, extrapolation beyond the data range, especially to deep liquefaction problems. And then there hasn't been a lot of modeler to modeler interaction. So the NGL project is providing a publicly available database in the form of a relational database for everybody to work with, and using a consensus approach that's kind of modeled after the NGA projects, where model development teams work together to develop their ground motion models. Here's a screenshot of our website. So all those beach balls are different earthquakes that have happened. They'll show the focal mechanism. And then if you click on one of those little yellow or green symbols with a number in it, it would pop up, and there's a bunch of like site investigation data in there. You can get boring logs, cone penetration tests. Here's an example from the Loma Prieta earthquake. You can get, images from reports. We store these in as binary large objects in the database. Screenshots of the in situ tests that were originally performed. Here's some photographs that are in there. These are observations of liquefaction. The one ground motion one is actually a ground motion based interpretation of liquefaction. When liquefaction happens, the frequency content of the ground shaking changes all of a sudden, which is what you're seeing there. Some work by Mike Greenfield and Steve Kramer. And then we have a bunch of lab tests. And so here's a pretty heavily instrumented site at Moss Landing, where you see all of the cone penetration tests, all of the observations there together. And this is the approach to the Bay Bridge. So you can click on these things in our GUI and see things like latitude and longitude and some descriptions. This GUI was all written by computer scientists from the Southwest Research Institute, who knows PHP, HTML, MySQL. So it's integrating all this stuff together. And then here's a description of some settlement that happened from Kayan et al. 1998 from the earthquake. You can also look at cone penetration tests and boring logs in our GUI. And here's the content of the database. So we have almost 1,000 CPTs and boreholes. This will continue growing. It's open. Anybody can put data in here. You can form a project team, put data in, and it's a good way of storing this information. We have shear wave velocity data, observation data, and all of the data is reviewed. So this is like the the drudgery, right? The work that nobody wants to do. We have to look at the data to make sure that it matches the original source documents, and that it's like, we don't make judgment calls about whether a particular standard penetration test value was good or not, because it was a hollow stem auger boring instead of a mud rotary boring or something like that's all subjective. We just make sure it matches the original document. And then the subjective part is up to the model development teams. They can decide which data to use and which not to use. What users can't do in our GUI is develop an end-to-end workflow. They can't query data and automatically get it into a pandas data frame and work with it to compute quantities and stuff like that. So if you go to the interact with data page, there's a couple things there. One is the schema. So you can see all of the tables in our database. I think we have 78 different tables. So the example that I showed only had 3. This one has 78. There's a lot of key constraints in there. So a lot of tables are related to each other. It's not all that easy to figure all this out, but I think the size of the database is now about 3 gigabytes or something like that. So it's more than you'd ever want to download into a single file. So the database gets copied every day to DesignSafe, where you can access it through Jupyter. And you can actually, I'm going to show you where to find this. Maybe my second live demo will go better. I need to hide these. These meeting controls are always right in the way. Okay, so if you go to the DesignSafe website, we have a resource that a lot of you may not be aware of called use cases. So a lot of us in DesignSafe have been working on developing use case products. These are really intended as like the smallest little building blocks for you to do a particular task. So feel free to go here and look through it. You can always borrow our code, integrate it with your own workflow. It's not plagiarism or anything like that, right? Because you're just taking stuff that we're making publicly available. So one of them is here, data analysis using NGL. We do have ones on machine learning, image tagging and stuff like that. So if you go here, we've got some documentation. Then you can read the documentation on your own. I won't go through it all, but if you click on this one, it should open up a Jupyter notebook that for some reason our images aren't showing up properly, but it should be runnable, right? So you just run some of these cells. If you don't want to see all this stuff, you can put a -Q on the pip install. This is installing the database connection script to the DesignSafe database. You don't have to know the password and connection credentials. Then here's a query, right? I'm selecting everything from the site table, and you can see that it's printing it to a pandas data frame. So there's 346 sites, and all that information is there. Here's one where we're getting information from the wildlife liquefaction array, which is a site in the Imperial Valley down where I grew up. That's very famous. It's recorded multiple earthquakes, and some have triggered liquefaction, some haven't. So there's that information there. So this is just kind of showing you how you could query the database and potentially develop your own workflow from it. Let's see. Oh, thanks, Robin. Yeah, this is a real life demo of what it's really like. Yep. Debugging is part of the problem. It's also really hard to debug when everybody's watching, right? Something about being on the clock makes it much more difficult. And then if you wanted to actually get the CPT data, here's one that's querying that table. In order to understand all this text, you would need to kind of go back and forth between the schema and the query, but it should all make sense. It's very logical. Databases are pretty straightforward things to work with. And here we're getting 2,400 rows of data. Each row is a separate measurement that has its own depth, tip resistance, sleep friction, and so forth. And then you can also do things like just get a list of all the tables. So here's all the tables that we have in there. 78, right? Because it starts indexing at 0. And then you can get information about any particular table too, if you want, right? So here's all the information about the borehole table. And then here's the counts. Hopefully these are So the amount of reviewed data is smaller, right? The design safe database only has data that's been reviewed. We have about 300 CPTs that haven't been reviewed yet, because that's the hard part of the work. There we go, back to the presentation. So, all right, so I've already shown this stuff. We also have other notebooks that will allow you to view standard penetration test data, cone penetration test data. They use widgets to create pull down menus and stuff like that. So if you're interested in developing those kind of interfaces in Python, those notebooks might be useful. And then I've already shown you these things. And then some of what we're doing with the data right now is developing a new model for liquefaction triggering. And, you know, one thing that we have is all of this cone penetration test data. And usually the cone data is sampled every centimeter or something like that. And what we want to do is identify soil layers from it. And so we've developed this clustering algorithm, which is an unsupervised machine learning algorithm, to automatically identify where those layers are. And then we can extract kind of average properties of the layers so that we can put them into other algorithms for predicting liquefaction. A common method of doing this in clustering is to use what's called the elbow method, which is really kind of a poorly defined concept, in my opinion. It's saying, like, if you have this cost function that is like a measure of the misfit between the data and the cluster center, it will reach a point where it kind of like curves down and eventually becomes zero or close to zero. And so that elbow is defined where the blue line is. What we found is that the elbow method doesn't do a very good job of picking the ideal number of clusters for us at all. It depends significantly on how deep is the cone penetration test, right? The selection of layers shouldn't depend on how deep you happen to push the cone. So we developed our own cost function that works a lot better, where we combine it with the average thickness. And that's the second cost function. And then we pick the minimum of that, and it gives us the number of layers in an automated way. This is important because there's, 1,000 CPTs. Other data sets, like the New Zealand Geotechnical Database, has about 60,000 CPTs. To do all of this manually would be really challenging, and not everybody has the same judgment. So what we're really trying to do is make a code that captures our own judgment here. And it works pretty well so far. And here's an example of all the different layers. And then we can extract properties and use those in other regressions. Here's one that shows all the data points that relate soil behavior type index to fines content. If you're a geotechnical engineer, you know what those things mean. We often assume that these are deterministically related to each other, and you can see that they're not, right? There's a lot of scatter, just like there is in all geotechnical engineering. So I sub C is not a great predictor of fines content, but there is a trend there. So now I'll move on to APIs and try and wrap up in 5 minutes or so there's time for some questions. All right, so we've talked about databases. We've seen that developing queries on databases can be really kind of challenging, right? You have to understand the structure of it. A lot of times owners of databases won't even allow users to query it because it can pose security problems and stuff like that. So what they do instead, and now my text is working just fine. I don't know what's going on. They set up an application programming interface. So an API really is just a piece of code that allows two computers to share information, or actually two different applications. They could be two applications on the same computer, but usually it's across computers. A lot of APIs are configured to take a user request, query a database, and then return some information. So this simplifies the access to data. It's a way of democratizing data. So users don't have to understand SQL in order to get data out. They can just write a simple URL, put a question mark at the end, and then put some parameters after it, and the database will return information to them. So APIs can also do a lot of other things, like you can use the Tapas API in DesignSafe to run high-performance computing jobs. You can make like a Python script that will dial up a high-performance run on OpenSeas or something like that, right? Just using the API. Otherwise, you'd have to do that on the command line or make a Slurm file or something. So there's just a lot of different ways of doing it. The format is something you probably are familiar with. You've probably seen URLs that look like this, right? You have a base URL. So in this case, this is the NASA API for like the planetary, or it's like the photo of the day, right? So you can go to this website and it'll actually return a JSON string that has a URL that will show the photo, but it will give you the photo of the day. And then if you wanted to have that show up on your website, it would refresh every day. When somebody came to the website, there would be a new NASA photo there for you. So you see the question mark, and this is the query string. So this is just saying that the API key is something that will authorize you to get the data. And we're using the demo key. So it's open to pretty much anybody just using that demo key. All right, so a lot of different software, or a lot of different data providers have created APIs to interact with their data. The one that I'll show you a little bit of is the USGS shake map products. So if you do earthquake research, you're probably familiar with these websites. You can go here to look at information from recent earthquakes. If you've ever felt a strong earthquake, you can go to the USGS website and do the "did you feel it" thing, right? You report that, yeah, I felt the earthquake, it woke me up, it was 4 a.m., you know, nothing broke, or whatever it is, and then it'll show you how many people have done that. So they have this map that shows contours of ground shaking, and you can get that map directly using a URL, right? You don't have to go and make a bunch of clicks through their website and download it. If you know how the API works, you can automate that and then integrate it with other data. And so, yeah, so now I'll go show you this other notebook. Hopefully this live demo will work. All right, so let's run these. Oh, I have to authenticate. Here we go. Ah, that's not what I wanted. So what I'm doing right now is authenticating to the NGL website through Jupyter. One way to do that is to go to the NGL website and authenticate. But when I authenticate here, the API will send me back a token, and I will receive this this token, which is like how come it's not creating? There we go. So if I do print token, it's this really long string, right? So this is an authorization token. It says, I have authenticated. The NGL server sent me back this token. If you were to copy this token and submit a request, you could do it, right? It would think that you're the authorized user instead of me. So the token expires in like a half hour or something like that. But this is how stateless APIs often work. You need a token or a key or something. And then I can query the database and get, you know, all of the sites. So this is the same query that we were running before. And then I guess I have to run through all of them. Well, another failed thing here. Let me see something real quick. I think that I have opened the wrong file. I think I wanted to open this version of it. All right. This is actually the version that I sent to Jasmine, I think. So anyway, I'll update those and make sure you have the right versions to share. So here's the API. I'm connecting now just to the design safe instance of the database. Here's how I connect to the USGS web page. So this is a web page that you can enter, and it will just return a GeoJSON file for you that has all of the magnitude 4.5 or bigger earthquakes in the last month, right? And then I use Python requests, so get URL, and then I load the resulting, the thing comes back as JSON, so you can load that JSON into a dictionary, and then you can create that as a pandas data frame if you want. So I'm parsing out some things to get a list of events here. One thing with APIs, you do have to understand the structure of the API, kind of look through the JSON that comes out. And then here I'm doing some more requests to get the event URL that's specified. So the event I'm specifying is the, index 1 event from the event list, and then I'm getting all of the contours of PGA and stuff like that. And then down here, I'm getting all of the sites from the NGL database. So I'm putting the shake map on top of all of the NGL sites that we have. And so here's the event that we're looking at. It's in the middle of the ocean somewhere, right? This is a difficult one to do because there's always earthquakes happening and the database gets updated all the time. So what shows up is going to change from minute to minute. Here's all the contours. These are all of our sites. So, there was not strong shaking at any of the sites that we have in the NGL database from that earthquake. I could load another one up here, like maybe number 2. Okay, that one was also not close to any of our sites, right? Many miles away from New Zealand or the Philippines where we actually have data. But what the value of this is that, Jasmine was mentioning reconnaissance, right? So anytime there's an event, in this case, an earthquake, it could be a hurricane or whatever, we send teams of people out to look at what happened. If we have data already, like if we have boring logs, CPTs, past observations of liquefaction or not, people should go to those sites, right? Because getting that data is really expensive. If we already know that those sites exist, people should go look. Even if nothing happened there, it's really useful to validate that nothing happened here. It's a no liquefaction case, right? Then it becomes a new case history. And so making these kind of products is really useful, and it does require integrating data from different databases together. So then, I'll just mention really quickly, we have another database too. This is an earthquake ground motion database. If you go to uclageo.com/GM database, the URL is in there in my slides. You can take a look at I think we have about 80,000 different 3-component ground motion records in this database at this point from all over the world, mostly the United States though, including a lot in the central and eastern United States. And this has that URL-based query. So I can show you hide meeting controls. So here's our ground motion database. Right here, I'm doing the flat file resource, which comes right before the question mark. And then I'm getting just all of the events, right? So this returns 680 different earthquakes in this big HTML table. HTML is nice if you just want to look at it, but if you want to write a computer code and integrate data, you'd probably want JSON instead. So we can do format equals JSON here, push enter, and then, unless this reminds me kind of like of the movie The Matrix, right? If you could make use of this using your eyes as we scroll through, that's great. But this would be more usable for a computer than for a person. And if you want it, also, you can do CSV and it will pop up a comma separated value file with all the data in it. So basically, the way this works is that we wrote the code where users will put information in here as a query string. And you could add other things like station, motion, for example, to make it like the thing from before. And now this is a much bigger table, right? 50,000 entries in this table. We're only looking at 50 of them here because it would be a lot. But anyway, it's a useful tool to have just because users might want all different kinds of information that we can't foresee. And so we've made it easy for users to get that info out. And then I'll just end by showing that recently Krishna Kumar at University of Texas has created a GPT-based bot that will write this query for you. So if you ask it, like he said, create an API request to filter all of the sites by VS30 in the range of 0 to 100. And the bot gave him this code, this URL right here, which is perfectly valid. Like if you copied this and pasted it into your browser, it would show all of the data for these stations. And then it explains what it was doing too, which is kind of amazing, right? So auto documenting. So this is an interesting use of ChatGPT. I asked Krishna if the chatbot had fallen in love with him, like that New York Times reporter, right, was chatting with Sydney, and Sydney was telling him, like, you should leave your wife because you love me instead, and stuff like that. So AI can go a little bit off the wall, but he said that hasn't happened yet. This is just for creating these API requests. So I think I'll go ahead and end it there, and I will open it for questions if there are some.
So I have a few questions, but since you don't have time, you don't have to answer all those questions. I think I can find them Googling. It's what mostly SQLite. So the time that you were getting connected to SQLite, I found out that you can it's only for one process to access it. Let's say that I have multiple process running in a embarrassingly lazy fashion, and they're trying to get connected to the same database. Is that possible?
Yeah, good question, Sina. So you can use like multi-threaded applications or multiple applications to access the same database at the same time. There are some exceptions though. So like SQLite, for example, if one process is writing to the database, the entire database is locked for all the other processes. So you can't write to the same SQLite database from two different processes at the same time. That's been a problem for us in some of our numerical simulations because we want to store the output in a database, and we're using Frontera to run like, 100 different nodes, each with 56 different processes at the same time. So you have to be a little careful about that. If it's just a read operation, yeah, no problem. You can read from the same database from different computers all at the same time. So if you had a HPC job on a whole bunch of different nodes, you could read from the same database.
It runs. It gives you an error, or just would just like put it in a queue so that the right operations could be done sequentially. Like
it throws an error. So I do a try except in mine, and if it works, that's great. It was successful in writing to the database. If it doesn't work, what I do is take the SQL command that it was trying to run and send it back to the controller node or controller process. And I store all those in an array. Right. And then at the end, I write all of those to the database, which isn't that many. Most of the time it works.
Thank you. Also, just one quick question. So there are other ways to handle a very large amount of data. For instance, there are some libraries that try to store pandas data frames or other data frames on a local on a memory, and do operations like sequentially on the memory, or like Hadoop, which is like designed to handle big data. What are the real differences between like these things, but in your prospect?
Yeah, so like HDF5 or H5 files are commonly used now, right? That's like a container. You can really put anything in there, and it organizes it all into a single file. Those can be used in a database kind of way, but it's still, you have to know the organizational structure. And if the H5 file is very big, I've never used an H5 file where you don't have to load the entire file into RAM before operating on it. And so I know there are ways to do it. I just haven't done it. And then there are also methods like Parquet. I know Sylvia is here. She's talked about Parquet. That will do like, data entry that's in a more modular form. So it's not the entire file. I don't know how it works on the back end, but there are other ways besides SQLite, right, of doing this sort of thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then I should say too, others, served databases like MySQL, they have row locking instead of database locking. So multiple users can write to the same database at the same time. Otherwise Facebook wouldn't work, right? Like if somebody's uploading a cat video, nobody else would be able to upload anything to Facebook during that time, right? So that's obviously not a viable solution for like those kind of platforms.
All right, so I guess this wraps up our workshop for today. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to shoot Dr. Brandenburg an email. And thank you all so much. Thank you, Dr. Brandenburg, for the great presentation today. Thank you for everyone for attending, and also our co-organizers for just putting this series on. And yeah, thank you all so much.
All right, thanks a lot.